Hi Mojotonians, I'm back. Alright, this is part 3 of the board construction on the 5E3 of the Mojotone kit. Andy Johnson with Mojotone, and this is it's not completed, but this is the stuffed main circuit board for the 5E3. This is how it should look, not, as long as your component placement's right. This is kind of sloppy, so sorry for that, please excuse that. This is how it's going to look before you start soldering the leads on, of course, that are on the wiring diagram. And I just wanted to show you component placement on the board itself. Top of the board looks great. Under the board looks like a bunch of dead-end roads on a map in Montana somewhere. But before you start soldering everything up, I like to get everything in place. The filter caps, of course, with like all their vintage amps, will rest right on the board, which isn't a problem. The SBE orange drops that we use, the 5 that are on the board here, what I like to do is actually elevate those a little bit, because if you see the legs on these, they come pre-bent from the factory. The reason I do this is because when you bend, I'll grab another orange drop here out of the box. You can see the pre-bend, exactly how they come from the factory. What I don't like is, the wonderful caps. I do like the caps. One thing I don't like to see people do is they'll actually take this leg and bend it back like this. Now this is an epoxy, heat resistant, of course, electrically neutral, inert epoxy that they cover the actual caps in. But what happens over time, and I've noticed it because I've serviced them like this, one of the inherent problems with, or actually I guess it would be a design problem, the actual tweed amp itself, is that the board sits in the amp like this. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the actual mechanical part, but the board is, of course, the backbone of the actual amp itself, or I guess you could say the spinal cord. The chassis is the backbone, but the tubes sit down here underneath the board, and of course where heat rises, it goes up into the actual chassis. So these components, after playing your 5E3 or even a larger like the Tweed Twin low and high powers, that chassis on top will get so hot that you can't touch it. It'll be 130, 140 degrees. Now, when you put unneeded stress on components like this, what can happen is that over a period of, say, 5 or 6 years of heat cycles, cool up warm up and cool down, is that you'll start developing cracks on the end of these caps, and they'll actually break. The original caps were plastic. I can't remember off the top of my head right now what they were, but I've actually seen that to where the leads will be coming out the ends of the actual. You can almost tell how many hours it has on it because they're coming out the end of the caps. Now the cap will still fully function like that, but what happens is that once you introduce any kind of foreign moisture or anything into the inside of this epoxy envelope, it will degrade the cap. It just builds as it goes. It gets worse and worse and worse and never gets better. So that's why I like to leave this little this little gap right here on the actual orange drops. That's kind of one of the things I do. Another thing is that I like to keep things on one plane. So when I look at an amp, I'm so used to looking at them that I can look briefly, especially in class. If you take the class, you'll see this. I can look at this with all the leads on it and start at one end and work my way down and back across the board in a matter of 30 seconds to figure out where the components are at, because I've taken, we built so many of these things. I can take a memorable photograph of this actual board in your head to see what's actually going on. And you'll if you stay with this and you start building more and more amps, you'll actually start to discover that as well. You can pick up problems in a matter of seconds if something doesn't look right. And again, this board isn't that big. It doesn't have that many components on it, so it's really easy to check. Another thing I like to do is try to keep your orientation all the same. And what that means is that down the road, again, we're always looking at these as a service friendly amp in case you need to do it. And it's very common among tube amps. 5-10 years down the road, something might happen to a component. You need to replace it. And if it's your amp, you know exactly where to look and exactly how things are laid out. I can see the values on the caps, I can see the values on the resistors, and I can also, when you're looking down at these orange drops, I have all the values and the actual part numbers in one direction, so I can look at it one way, look right down and see that they're all the same. Of course, again, like I said in the last video, the information on the caps themselves are accessible. And I like to keep the orientation of the resistors in the same way. Not necessary whatsoever. Like I said in the video before this, resistors are not polarized. This is more of an aesthetic thing. And it comes in with good build practices to where if you keep everything consistent, if you're noticing where these bands are at and the orientation of the bands, you're not only noticing that, you're actually noticing the value of the resistor itself. So that means you actually took 1 or 2 seconds to look at the resistor to make sure it's the right value and not just sticking something in there. That the best builders do that. They keep everything consistent in every single one of their amps. If you're looking, any of the boutique amps from model to model, you'll see the exact same placement, the exact same resistors, everything, and that has to do with service, of course, with cleanliness, and a lot of, I'm sure a lot of the guys in the music industry are, they're really anal, and they're actually artists when they do this kind of stuff. It's amazing. Some of the stuff's beautiful, especially the old high watts. But that's why things like this are laid out the way they are. Of course, the original Fenders didn't have that. They weren't sloppy whatsoever. They were very regimented in the way they do things. But it was very interesting to see a 59 5E3 come off the line in February and a 59 5E3 come off the line in August, and you would actually see it looks the same on the surface from 10 feet away, but when you start to get to it, look up on it, certain things are certain ways that certain builders like to do that, and it's kind of cool. It's a very personalized, individualistic thing when they were building these amps. And yes, you already know that they were 100% hand built all the way. It was crazy. And anyway, we'll get more into that later. But what I want to do right now is that I'm going to start soldering this, and so you'll see a real-time actual time of how long it actually takes to solder this up. Now this board took me 14-15 minutes to lay out like this. Everything is on there. Everything is bent over, so if I shake this, nothing's going to fall off, which is good. That's exactly what you want. Of course, your cathode resistor are going to be flopping around on your bypass caps, but we'll get to that here in a second. And I do this before we add the leads, and I'll explain why once we get to the leads. So what I'm going to do is I'm starting from the bottom left. Let me clean my soldering iron again. And we're just going to solder and move our way down, all the way down as we do this. 1, 2, 3, and this shouldn't take that long. I mean, we're looking at a process of maybe 5 minutes. Maybe. Not really sure. I never really timed because I never really considered this a race. But of course, different people work at different speeds. This is not a race thing. You do not want to do that because you might save 2 or 3 seconds now, but once you get this board into the actual chassis itself and you start having issues with it, you're going to cost, your time is going to be elevated exponentially down the line just trying to troubleshoot some little simple error that you had while you're trying to rush through it. And this is not one of those things that you want to rush through. Okay, this has got to be right. You can fix tube sockets, you can fix all the mechanical stuff, as it's actually in the build itself. But this you don't want to mess with, because once the component is in place, you never want to touch it again unless you have to replace it. Okay. So here we're going to go along the top, again working from left to right along the top, and you can notice how long each solder joint takes me. It's probably 3 to 5 seconds to do this. And I just realized doing this that I forgot my ground bus is along the top of the filter supply, but that's okay. We'll come back to that. Okay, so we're going down, And again, another reason, I think I mentioned this in the last video, but another reason I like doing this is because when we start to put the leads on, the pushback cloth solid 22 gauge wire on, you're going to be moving this board all over the place, left, right, up, down, upside down. You're going to access the back of it. You're going to be doing all kinds of stuff with it, and we want to be absolutely, positively, 100% sure that that component does not fall off or move around in any way as we're doing this. So again, it's a pay attention to detail of what you're doing, and you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble down the line. Okay, so I'm going to left to right bottom, left to right top. Now what I'm going to do is go through the center to make sure all our solder joints are done in the center there. Move this up again, clean them iron. Go right down the center. Try not to hit any of the other components. Make sure we have good spread, which we do. I'm going to open our caps up here, and one cool thing about these vintage amps, you can move these parts all over the place. They're not SMD or through-hole PCB where there's a certain tension on them. You can actually move these around to where you can access the solder joints on them. Of course, if you're if you're servicing a vintage amp, you do not want to be moving the components around like this a lot, because you're dealing with 60, 65-year-old components, and it's just not cool if you break a component just by moving it around, because guess what? You just devaluated the amp. Especially because I'm 100% original, so you need to be really careful with that. I'm going to slide that back up here. Okay, so now I'm doing the cathode resistor for our driver tube here. Where's that? I don't remember what that's for. Yeah, that's for a driver tube. First section of it. Okay, spreading the cap so we can get access to the center of this. Let me clean that up here. I'll show you why I'm cleaning this as I go. Again, this is a rosin core solder that will build up on the tip, and this solder has an acid, like I said before in the other video. This has an acid flux to it that is great for cleaning soldering. If you know what you're doing, you can get a perfect solder joint, 99.9% of the time. But it is very corrosive for starting our tips. Each class we replace the tip because it's very corrosive, and it eats away. I'm not sure what I don't think they use Inconel. I'm not sure what kind of material they use for the tips, but it is it's made to erode away, which is kind of good because it holds all the solder itself into place. Okay, so here we have our board, and I'm checking everything to make sure I got it right. Or the soldering, make sure I covered everything. Okay, now I'm looking at the back. Now at this point I'm going to leave this on here because when I go to wire this, I'm going to need to reheat and insert wires into this board, as well as the jumpers up here that I forgot before, but that's okay. I got to reheat these anyway, and that will be in the next video. Okay, there's some close-ups of what's actually going on there. Try to keep everything uniform. And if you have a kit moving forward, I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but the carbon comp resistors, especially the ones that are used very often in circulation, like the 100K and the 220K, 1.5K, are becoming more and more scarce. They're getting hard to find, so we're actually having to substitute some carbon film stuff, which isn't a problem. It tonally, especially in the positions that they're in, doesn't matter. It's a voltage regulation versus a signal regulation, so it's not that big of a deal. We're having to change those out a little bit. So if you have your kit and you get a resistor, I just happen to have one. It looks like this, which is a little bit different. I don't know if you can see that here. It looks different than a carbon comp, but there's no physical electronic difference with this. Okay, there isn't in the terms of using them in this amp. Okay, if you have any questions about anything I just did, please leave in the comments below, or email tech at Mojotone, and we can certainly work through it. We pride our customer service of helping customers trying to keep this equipment alive, because again, this is our history. This is American history, and it is really freaking cool, and the rest of the world knows it. Alright? So get your kit. Let's get some stuff built. Thanks for watching. Take care.